Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Chaf Bet. We've been speaking about renting out a field or a bathhouse to a non-Jew, and now we're going to talk about partnerships. Hanhu mori ka'eh de goy naket b'shabeta v'Yisrael bechad b'shabeta atul kamed rava shera lehu. You had these saffron growers. It's a very expensive spice. And you have this Jew and this non-Jew who own the saffron field together. And the non-Jew would take from it on Shabbat. He would take possession on Shabbat and work the field and collect. And the Jew would take the field on Sunday and work the field on Sunday. And then they would split the profits so that the non-Jew would be allowed to work, because he's working on Shabbat and he's getting the profits from that day, and the Jew would exclusively take the profits on Sunday. And so that way they could work the field all 7 days. So they came to Rava to ask him if this is permitted, and Rava says, yes, it's permitted. You both own the field. So the non-Jew is allowed to work on Shabbat in his own field, and he has partnership in it. So he can do for what he wants in his interest, and the Jew is not benefiting from it because the Jew is not getting from the benefit of the work on Saturday because he's taking Sunday instead. Itibe Ravina l'Rava. But now Ravina challenges Ravina's student, and he challenges from Baraita. Yisrael v'goy shekibelu sadeh b'shutafut. Lo yomar l'Yisrael legoy tol chelkecha b'Shabbat v'ani b'hol. If you have a Jew and a non-Jew who have a field in partnership, the Jew should not tell the non-Jew, you take your portion on Shabbat, and I will take my portion during a weekday. So you see, it's not allowed to do that. The Baraita does continue and say when it is allowed, v'mitnu metechila mutar, if they made a stipulation from the beginning, from before they started working on the field. They say, listen, this coming year, you'll take the Saturdays, I'll take the Sundays. That's okay, because they already split it in that time division from before. But if not, if they come to make a calculation at the end, during the year, the non-Jew worked it on Shabbat and the Jew worked it on Sunday, but they never said, all right, you'll get the profits from that day, I'll get the profits from this day. They never said anything like that. Only at the end of the year they say, let's see, how many Shabbatot were there? How many Yomim Tovim were there? Let's multiply that, then take away this number, and I would take all those Sundays and so on. And they make the calculation afterwards, then it's no good. And so right now we're assuming that in this case of the saffron growers, they did not make such an arrangement before. Ichsif, so Rava was embarrassed because he made the wrong decision. He says, it's terrible. I told him it was allowed, but really, Ravina, now you told me this baraita, now I see it's not allowed. So he went back and checked into it further. Lesof igalai milita dehitnu meikarahavu. And in the end, it was revealed that in fact, this Jew and non-Jew did make a stipulation from the outset that they would divide it in this way. So therefore, Rava's ruling was correct. Now, Rava should have made sure and checked on that. So it turned out it was correct. But actually, it would depend on them making it from before, and not if they only made a calculation afterwards. Rav Giviha mi bekatil amar hanahu shitile de orla hava goy achil shene de orla v'Yisrael shene de hetera atul kamed rava shera lehu. We have a different version of that story that just happened. Rav Gaviha from Beketil said, no, it wasn't regarding Shabbat and weekday, that the non-Jew worked it on Shabbat, but rather it was a sapling which is prohibited to benefit from for the first 3 years, and then the 4th year has to be benefit only in Yerushalayim, and only from then on can the Jew benefit from it. But this sapling was owned by a Jew and a non-Jew together in partnership, and they made a deal that the non-Jew would benefit from it for the first years while it was orla and prohibited, and then the Jew would take an equal number of years afterwards when it was permitted. And they came before Rava, and Rava said it's permitted. That was the case. Okay, now that's the whole story. But we know that Ravina challenged Rava from a baraita, and so where's the challenge? And the answer is no. he brought a baraita to support it, because in fact this was a case where they stipulated from before, and so there was no problem, and it was not a challenge, but rather a support. Wait, but we have in the first tradition that Rava was embarrassed. So that means that he was challenged, right? So wasn't he embarrassed? And in this version, we say, no, Rava was never embarrassed. So it's a totally different story in this case. First of all, it's not about Shabbat, but rather about Olah. And Ravina brought the Braita as support because they knew that, in fact, there was a stipulation from before, and Rava was never embarrassed, but rather he said, oh, thank you. You gave me a good support for the halacha that I said. Now we ask, what if they did not specify not one, and they also did not calculate. In other words, we saw before, if they specified from the beginning, then it's permitted that they're going to split the profits. If they did not specify but made a calculation later, then it's no good. But what if they didn't do either of those? They didn't make a stipulation before, but they also did not make an exact calculation afterwards. This is how many Shabbats, this is how many years, this is how many, right? But rather they just, one worked on Shabbat, one didn't work on Shabbat, and then they just split everything in the middle. How about that? Let's try to answer it from the Braita. Braita says if they made a condition from the beginning, it's permitted. That means if they didn't make a condition, it would be prohibited, even whether or not they made a calculation later. So doesn't that mean it's prohibited? No, but look, Emasefa. We can also make an inference from the rest of the Braita. If they go and make a calculation afterwards specifically, then it's prohibited. But if they didn't do that, then it would be allowed. Rather, you see from the Braita only gives the two extreme cases, but doesn't give the middle case, and therefore we cannot learn about this middle case from the Braita. Hadran alach lifnei edehen. And now we begin the second perek. En ma'amidin behema bepundekaot shel goyim mipnei shechashudin al harebi'ah. A Jew should not give his animal to a non-Jewish innkeeper to watch for him. I'm going away for a few days. Can you watch this animal for me? One should not do that because these goyim are suspected of bestiality, and non-Jews are also prohibited in that. And therefore, by giving them the animal, we would be putting a stumbling block before the blind. And so in order to ensure that there will not be any sin, one should not give his animal to such people who are suspected to violate the sin. And furthermore, a Jewish woman should not be secluded with a non-Jew because non-Jews are suspected of forbidden relations. And even though the Jewish woman is married, we suspect that they will go and try to have relations with her. Now, the truth is that yichud, being in private, is prohibited for a Jewish man and a Jewish woman also. But this one is even more stringent, because this halacha means that even if the non-Jewish man has his wife there, his non-Jewish wife is together, still the Jewish woman should not be secluded with that non-Jewish man. Unlike if it's Jews and the couple is there, then there's no problem of yichud. And further, a man should not seclude himself with the goyim because they are suspected of bloodshed. And if you're alone with some goy, then he may kill you. So don't be alone with them. All right. So this is problematic because every non-Jew is suspected of all these terrible sins, murder and incest and bestiality. So the Meiri famously said this is not talking about the non-Jews of his time who are civilized, who have laws, who have a sense of right and wrong. But we're talking about if you lived like in the Aztec society. If you are alone with them, they probably will tear out your heart and eat it. So it's not a good idea to be alone visiting some Aztec community. So indeed, there were times and places in history where one would have to be careful about all these things. And so in that kind of culture, then yes, do not give your animal to such people. But again, the Meiri says it does not apply in his days and certainly will not apply in most of the world today. Urminhi, and now we have a challenge to the Mishnah from a Baraita. Lochin mehen behema lekorban, ve'en choshishin lo mishum robeah ve'lo mishum nirba ve'lo mishum mukseh ve'lo mishum ne'avad. The Baraita teaches that one is allowed to buy an animal from a non-Jew to use for a korban. I want to bring a korban olah. So I go to a non-Jew who raises the animals and I buy it from him. And I don't have to worry that this goy who raised the animal sinned with it, not as an active partner, not as a passive partner, nor do I have to worry that he set it aside for idolatry, nor that he actually worshipped it. Either if he set it aside or if he's actually worshipped it, then that would be prohibited. And also, if a person sinned with the animal, also, it would be prohibited to use for a korban. And you don't have to worry about that. You can buy the animal. So this seems to contradict the Mishnah. Now the second two are not a question, because if the non-Jew had set it aside or worshipped it as an idol, then that non-Jew would already consider it to be holy, to be a god. And he certainly would not sell it, because he's worshiping it. So he wouldn't sell it to a Jew to go and sacrifice it in the Jewish Bet HaMikdash. So that we understand, there's no problem. If he sold it to you, that means he didn't worship it as an idol. But regarding sinning, committing bestiality with it, maybe they did. And then they sold it to a Jew. So how come the Mishnah says we worry that these goyim are going to commit bestiality, but here in the Baraita, we don't worry about it. Amarav Tachlifa, Amarav Shela, Bar Avina, Mishmed Rav, Goy, Chas al Behemto, Shelo Te'acher. And the answer Rav says is that a Goy is worried and would not want his own animal to become barren. They had an idea that if one sins with an animal, then if it's a female animal, it will become barren. So if they own the animal, they're not going to sin with it. So therefore, you're allowed to buy an animal from a non-Jew who owns it, because while he owns it, he's not going to sin with it. That's different from giving a Jew giving his own animal over to a non-Jew to watch for him. Now, since the non-Jew doesn't own it, he doesn't care if he gets barren. So that's where we worry that the pundikait will sin with it, or the pundikai, the inn owner, will sin with the animal. Then we worry because he doesn't own it. But as long as he owns it, he's not going to sin with it. Okay, this reasoning applies only if the animal is a female. Then the non-Jewish owner of it is going to not sin with it because he doesn't want it to become barren. But what if the animal is a male? So then the male is not going to become barren by sinning. A woman sinning with it, so maybe the non-Jew who raises it will sin with it. So how could we buy it and use it as a korban? Rav Kana says no. There's another worry that if one sins even with the male, it will make it deteriorate or make it weak. And this flesh weak, and the owner never wants to do that because then it will lose value. And so we don't have to worry that any non-Jew who raises animals and owns the animals is going to sin with it, and therefore one can buy such animals. Wait, now there's another braita that says one is allowed to buy an animal from a shepherd. Now the shepherd is not the owner. He's just watching over it. He's hired to watch over someone else's animals, and it's okay, you can buy from the shepherd. Why don't we worry that the shepherd will sin with the animal? Because the shepherd doesn't care about long term. He just has to make sure that the animals eat for a day and no harm comes to them. So why should that be allowed? If in the Mishnah you said that we worry that goyim commit bestiality, then how come over here it says you're allowed to buy it from the shepherd? And the answer is no, the non-Jewish shepherds are worried because they don't want to lose their sages, and if someone finds out that they're doing things with the animals that they're watching, and that's bad for the animals, then they will lose their salary, and so they are fearful and don't do that. Well, then how do you explain another braita that says a Jew is not allowed to deliver his animal to a non-Jewish shepherd. Is not allowed. Why is it not allowed? So we worry that they're going to sin with it. Why do we worry? Why don't we say that the non-Jewish shepherd is going to be worried? He doesn't want to lose his wages, and someone might find out, and so he'll be careful, and therefore one should be allowed to give his animals over to a non-Jewish shepherd to watch. And the answer is that regarding non-Jews themselves, among each other, they are aware of each other's actions, they know, and so therefore they're careful. If a shepherd would sin in such a way, then the other non-Jews would know, and the owner would know, and refuse his salary. But the Jewish community is not as close, and so if someone in the non-Jewish shepherd community sinned, the Jew would not know, and therefore the non-Jewish shepherd is not going to be scared of being found out, and that's why it's prohibited. Rabba says this is an instance of the common folk saying that the stylist etches script upon marble. Just like that, a sinner knows his fellow sinner. In other words, marble is very hard, and yet a stylus made out of metal that etches into it is even harder and can make lines in it. And so just like something that is very hard, like marble, knows the stylus and is going to be affected by it, so too, in other words, like things are know each other. So too, a sinner knows a fellow sinner. If you want to know, who is a sinner, ask another sinner. They know best, which FBI does a lot. When they want to catch a criminal, they'll go ask other criminals. They'll ask people who are scam artists to go and figure out who is a scammer. They hired hackers, criminal hackers. They'll bring them in and say, "Listen, we'll give you less time in jail if you go and find other hackers," because it takes a sinner to know a sinner. So that's the idea, that the non-Jewish owners will recognize the sins of the shepherds if they sin with the animals, but the Jews will not as readily be able to recognize if a non-Jewish shepherd sinned with the animals under his watch. And now a follow-up question to something that we asked above. If it's indeed so that a male would not engage in bestiality with a female animal because then it will be barren, then how about a male animal with a female? We should not buy such an animal because we should worry that perhaps the female owner engaged in bestiality with the male. We did say above that it would weaken the male, but apparently now we are not buying that answer, so we're looking for a different answer. And this new answer is kevan de migareba mirteta. Since if a woman would engage in bestiality with a male animal, then it would start following her around, and she would be afraid that if it starts following her around, everybody's going to say, "Hey, why is that animal following her around? Oh, she must have sinned with it." And so she's afraid of that, and therefore she will not engage in such a sin. Ela detane Rav Yosef ar malta la tirabe kalba vela tishre barbera beushpiza bishlama barbera v'siniyala ela kalba kevan de migaraba mirteta. But we have a challenge to this answer. Is that really true that an animal will follow around a woman who sins with it? Then how come we have a teaching from Rav Yosef who says that a widow, it means a Jewish widow, should not raise a dog because we're afraid that even a Jewish widow, if she's lonely, who knows what might happen, and she also should not allow a student, a Torah scholar, to sleep in her home as a lodger because we don't want anything to happen. Now we understand regarding the student is discreet and embarrassed, and if she would sin with him, she knows that he's not going to say anything, and so she may be open to sinning with the student. So therefore, a student should not be alone. It's also yichud to be with a widow with a student. But regarding the dog, what's the problem? She would be afraid that if she sins with the dog will start following her. So she's not going to do that. If you say that it's not that dog's going to follow her, then that if she sins with it, then we shouldn't worry about this, and the widow should be able to raise a dog. And we answer, Kevan dechishadia umsa misricha batra, memar amri inashe haide misricha batra mishum umsa teka misrich. No, since also if she throws the dog a piece of meat, it will also follow her. So she may sin with it, and people will say, oh, why is the dog following her? It must be that she fed it. She threw it a piece of meat, and so they will assume that she just fed it, and therefore the widow might reason that, I'll sin with it, and so what if it follows me? People will assume that I just fed it. And that's why a widow is prohibited from raising a dog alone. But apparently that will not work for the non-Jews, where people will assume that, the dog is following her, and therefore she will refrain because people there in that society will assume, look, it's following her. She must have sinned with it, and therefore a non-Jew will refrain from such a sin with a male animal, and therefore one is allowed to buy an animal from a non-Jew to use for a korban. And now we ask, how come we do not allow women to be secluded with female animals? So the females together, the female animal and the female person, they can't sin together. They can't do an act. So what's the problem? And so the answer is because regarding the goyim, the men go and visit the wives of their friends when their friends aren't home, maybe when their friends are home, and want to be with them. And sometimes he'll go over to his friend's wife's house and won't find her there, but the animal will be there, and then he will commit bestiality with the animal instead. So we're afraid of the male neighbors. And some say that even if the man comes over and finds his neighbor's wife home, still he may prefer the animal over this woman. As the master said, that people would prefer the animal of a Jew over their wives. So it could be that the wife is home, and the guy some neighbor will come over, and even if she's home, she says, but look at that animal, and be more attracted to the animal. And so we do not allow women to be alone with even a female animal. As Rabbi Yochanan says, when the snake sinned with Chava, this is not in the Torah, but in the Midrash, the snake was jealous. It saw Adam and Chava having relations, and it was jealous, and the snake had relations with her, and during that time, it placed contamination in her and caused such appetite for sin to be present. Well, if that's true, then that should also apply to Jews. How come you said that only non-Jews do this? Yisrael shamdu al Har Sinai, paskazo matan. Well, because once Bnei Yisrael stood at Har Sinai, so that contamination for that sin stopped. Goyim shalom du al Har Sinai, lo paskazo mutan. Whereas Goyim who did not stand at Har Sinai, that contamination continued. Now, question, what about birds? Are we afraid that people will commit sin with a bird? And the answer is yes, because Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shemuel, name of Rabbi Chanina, I once saw a goy bought a goose, and he committed a sin with it, and then he strangled it, roasted it, and ate it. And Rabbi Midifti says, I saw a certain Arab who bought a thigh of meat on the marketplace and made a hole in it, just the right size, and he did what he had to do, in that hole, and then he also roasted it and ate it. And so from these stories, this was eyewitness of these rabbis, that they saw the people around them committing these horrible things, and so that's why they made all these laws to keep far away from such things. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.